All right, today we are digging into the hidden history of autism. And trust me, it's a story that's way more complex and honestly, way more surprising than the one most of us have been told. It's a history that's been overlooked for pretty much a century. So let's get right into it.
So let me just start with this. Whatever you think you know about the history of autism, well, it's probably not the whole story. It's not wrong necessarily, but it's definitely incomplete. This is a history packed with forgotten pioneers, some really painful detours, and eventually some powerful revolutions in how we think.
You know, for decades, the official story always began in the exact same place. It was always this tale of two men, working totally separately during the chaos of World War II, who both somehow managed to describe this unique condition they were seeing in children. And here they are, Leo Kanner over in the US and Hans Asperger in Austria. In 1943 and 1944, they published these papers that basically defined the entire field for the next 40-plus years. Kanner came up with the term early infantile autism, while Asperger, who was writing in German, used the phrase autistic psychopathy. For the longest time, these two were just it. They were seen as the dual founders of everything we thought we knew.
What's pretty amazing, though, is how much of what Kanner first observed has stuck around. I mean, based on a study of just 11 kids, he pinpointed these core traits. It shows up early, there are challenges with social communication, and you see these restricted or repetitive behaviors. Those three pillars, they're still the bedrock of how autism is diagnosed today.
But, and this is a big but, here's where the official story starts to unravel. Even Kanner himself, years and years later, admitted something huge. In a talk in 1969, he actually said, "I did not discover autism. It was there before." And with that one sentence, he basically told the world that a massive piece of the puzzle was missing.
Kanner's quote really opens the door to this hidden history, right? It's the story of a pioneering psychiatrist whose incredible work was almost completely lost, just buried by geopolitics, probably sexism, and what you could call the fog of history.
So meet Grunya Sukhareva, a Soviet psychiatrist. Back in the 1920s, she was working at a children's clinic in Moscow, and the stuff she was documenting, it's just extraordinary. And this wasn't hidden away. Her super detailed case studies were published in a top German psychiatric journal, so they were out there for the whole European academic world to see.
Just look at this timeline for a second because it changes everything. Sukhareva published her first big paper in 1926. 1926, that is 17 years before Kanner and 18 years before Asperger. She was describing kids with autistic traits almost 2 full decades before the men who got all the credit. And her descriptions were so incredibly on point. She wrote about what she called an autistic attitude that made kids pull away from others. She saw their abstract thinking, their obsessive tendencies. She even wrote about one kid whose peers called him the talking machine because he would talk so much about his interests. I mean, how modern does that sound? So the big question is, why was she forgotten? As one historian put it, the fact that her work was invisible for almost a century is one of the oddest things in this whole story. Was it because she was a woman or a Soviet Jew in an era of rising anti-Semitism? We might never know for sure, but her absence left this giant hole in the narrative. Okay, so with Sukhareva's work basically unknown, the field took a really painful and damaging wrong turn. For decades, the entire conversation shifted from trying to understand autism to just blaming people for it, and it created this horrible legacy of shame and guilt for so many families. This was the dark age of the refrigerator mother. It was this completely baseless, incredibly cruel theory that said autism was basically a psychological injury caused by mothers who were emotionally cold. There was zero scientific evidence for it, but it became this dominant idea in psychiatry, and it caused an unbelievable amount of pain. The end of this awful chapter finally came in 1977. A huge landmark study of twins came out, and it provided clear, convincing evidence of important hereditary influences. Science finally caught up and proved what parents had been saying all along. Autism is neurobiological. It has nothing to do with bad parenting.
So, with those blame-based theories finally thrown out, the stage was set for the next big revolution in thinking. The whole idea of autism as the single, rigid category just started to fall apart, and it was replaced by a much more nuanced and frankly more accurate idea: the spectrum.
See, for a long time, psychiatrists were what you'd call splitters.
If you look at the old diagnostic manual, the DSM-4, you had all these different labels. You could get diagnosed with autistic disorder or Asperger syndrome or this catch-all category, PDD-NS. It was all about putting people into these separate, distinct boxes. But a massive shift was on the horizon, one that a psychiatrist named Lorna Wing had actually proposed way back in 1981. The field started moving away from splitting all these conditions apart and started moving toward lumping them together. And that's the change we see reflected when we went from the DSM-4 to the modern DSM-5.
And then, with the DSM-5, poof, those separate boxes were gone. They were all replaced by one single unifying diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. This was the moment it became official. These traits exist on a continuum. They show up in endless combinations, and at all different levels of intensity. It's not one thing. It really is a spectrum.
And that brings us to the most recent and maybe the most powerful chapter in this whole story. This is a revolution that wasn't led by doctors, but by autistic people themselves. They began to reclaim their own identities and completely redefine what it means to be autistic.
The core idea here is neurodiversity. The term was coined back in 1998 by an advocate named Judy Singer, and it's a simple but profound idea. Just like biodiversity in nature, there is natural diversity in human brains. And in that framework, autism isn't a disorder or a list of things that need to be fixed. It's just a different and totally valid way of being. You can really feel the power of that shift in this quote from author and advocate John Robison. He explains that the word neurodiversity just doesn't carry that same heavy stigma. It opens up the possibility that, yeah, there are challenges, but there are also amazing strengths and unique ways of seeing the world. This whole new perspective gave birth to a powerful advocacy movement. And it has a very clear, very simple motto: nothing about us without us. It is a demand, a rallying cry, for autistic people to be at the table for every conversation, every research project, and every policy that is going to affect their lives. So after all that, what's the big takeaway from this hidden history? I think it shows us that the story of science is often messy, right? It's full of forgotten heroes and some major wrong turns. But what becomes clear is that science gets better. It truly advances when it starts being more inclusive, when it recognizes diversity, and when it widens its scope to see the whole picture. The real question now is, what new chapter will that way of thinking help us write next?